series. And we are very happy and delighted to have Professor Dr. Mattia Nardotto. A brief introduction about him. He's currently an associate professor at KU Leuven, Belgium, Department of Management, Strategy and Innovation. His research interests include industrial organization, competition policy, political economy, behavioral economics. He obtained his PhD in economics from University of Bologna in the year 2011. He also holds an MA in economics. His research work has been published in various reputed journals, including a Review of Economic Studies, Management Science, Journal of the European Economic Association, etc. He also writes for some of the policy journals. Apart from that, he's currently also working on piracy in digital markets, broadband internet, and other works. So today he's going to present a paper titled as Mums Go Online, Is the Internet Changing the Demand for Healthcare? It's very interesting and a relevant title. So basically, he's going to study the effect of internet diffusion on childbirth procedures performed in England between 2000 and 2011. And he has got some very interesting results. He finds that the broadband internet access increased, in fact, cesarean sections. And the effect is driven by first-time mothers who are more likely to obtain an elective C-section. Without further ado, we would like to hear more from Professor Mattia. May I please request you to start the presentation, and thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me and also for giving this nice introduction. Nicely summarized the paper. So yeah, that's indeed the topic. So we studied the introduction of a new media, so the internet, and how this changed procedures in healthcare. And we think that our results have external validity. So it changed the healthcare sector and the relationship between patients and doctor more broadly than just childbirth procedures.
To cut you short, to all the attendees, you can please ask your question in Q&A box. So I'll be collating the questions and asking to Dr. Mattia. So do write your questions in Q&A box, and also we're going to have a Q&A section in the end. Thank you. Yeah. Over to you, Dr. Mattia.
Thanks. So basically our paper kind of follows up on observations that came out in the medical literature and a discussion in the medical literature where doctors kind of noticed that the relationship and argued that the relationship between them and their patients was changing with the introduction of the internet. So this is a quote from a very respected journal in medicine, which is the New England Journal of Medicine. That's an issue of 2010. And basically that's what the authors argue, that clinical practice fundamentally changed with the introduction of the internet, which essentially changed the role of patients and doctor and the degree of asymmetric information in the market between the two parties. This article was not alone. More and more doctors, practitioners, observers, and even the press realized that something was going on in the healthcare sector. So doctor-patient relationship is changing. Patients are seeking for information online. I'm sure that most of the people who are attending the seminar, when they now feel some symptoms, the first entity they ask to is Dr. Google. And that's actually a cover that you see on the right of a recent issue of The Economist that has a couple of articles talking about this. So patients have this desire to better monitor their health status, to get better, quicker diagnosis for symptoms that they feel. And on the internet, you can now find a lot of information, applications also for your smartphones and so forth, that kind of meet this desire of these needs of patients. So there is a broad question that we want to contribute, that is then, is the provision of healthcare changing? So with patients that get access to this wide variety of information, are they getting different treatments? Can they put pressure on doctors to get what they think is best for them, and what is best for them they learn through these sort of unofficial channels? They learn it on the internet. So we have to remember, at least in the European countries, doctors are still supposed to be the final gatekeepers of prescription of drugs and medical procedures. So they are the agent that still has the power to decide and determine the final supply of treatments, of procedures, of drugs, and so on. Of course, when you meet a patient that thinks he knows what he wants, then also depending on the incentives that are at play, the supply can change. So that was the motivation for us to run this study. And basically, of course, I mean, we try to confine ourselves to a setting in which we can say something that we find interesting, and then later on I will say why we think this is a nice setting. But we decide to go for a specific procedure for which we have good data and we think it has good properties. So our research question in this specific paper is whether the internet diffusion affected childbirth procedures performed in England in the first decade of the 2000s, that is the decade when internet was introduced in the UK. So you can see that broadband penetration went up throughout the decade. You still had areas with and without internet, and internet rollout was subject to kind of shocks that we kind of exploit for identification purposes. So what is our methodology and the main results? So our identification strategy to get to causal estimates is based on exogenous geographical discontinuities in the rollout and in the diffusion of internet, which are orthogonal to characteristics of patients. So these are the classic exogenous shocks that you would like to have to get to causal identifications, because they simply come from technological factors. Okay, so to give you a quick idea of what we are gonna do, let me show you this figure. Wait, I can maybe go full screen so then you see better. We are gonna do the following exercise. So we are gonna compare very narrow geographical areas. Here you can see the red block and the green block. These are blocks in the very same city, very small in size, with identical people living there. The difference between the two blocks is only in the exposure to the internet. And then we will compare mothers living in the gray area, in the green area, and mothers living in the red area. And they have different internet access due to technological factors that are orthogonal to their characteristics, which are anyway balanced. So that's our identification strategy in a nutshell. What we then measure is that an increase in internet speed, so the quality of internet connection, increases the C-section rate, so changes behavior of patients, what they get from their doctors. And we can estimate that internet diffusion accounted for approximately 1/5 of the total increase in C-section rates that was experienced in the UK in this decade. We also see, and that's interesting, that the effect is driven by mothers, so patients who are inexperienced. So it's driven by first-time mothers. So mothers who really need to gather information because they have no previous experience on this procedure. It's also, the effect is driven by less educated mothers. So mothers that can have more difficulties in processing the information they find online and understand whether it's reliable information or not, whether it's the appropriate procedure for them. Finally, we also see that mothers who are switching to this procedure, they don't really need it from a medical perspective. So they don't have risk factors that should lead them to have a C-section, which is a surgery at the end of the day. And that's why we find no impact on healthcare outcomes. So they don't improve in healthcare. They're also not doing worse. They just generate extra costs for the national health system and national health service, because this type of procedure is more expensive than natural delivery. Yeah, so that's what I showed you already. So if there are no questions, I can maybe give you a bit of institutional details, and then we can continue with the empirical analysis. So during the first decade of the 2000s, with the introduction of broadband in the UK, we saw a rapid proliferation of health-related websites. Again, meeting the desire of internet users to learn about healthcare topics. So these are figures coming from a survey running in the US at the middle of our sample, so in 2006. And the numbers are very clear. So 80% of internet users or respondents to this survey stated that they use the web to get health or medical information. Among them, almost 60%, so 60% of people searched for information online, then declare that the information they found influenced their decision to treat an illness or a condition. Almost 55% also declare that what they learn on the internet led them to ask further questions to the doctor. And more than a third of them also even say that the decision in the first place to go to a doctor or not was influenced by what they learned online. Moving to childbirth, so this was kind of general questions on healthcare. But moving on childbirth, we find similar numbers. So again, 80% of mothers, this in the first bullet, it's a survey on US mothers and families. They declare that what they learned online influenced or their behavior during pregnancy and what they asked to their doctors. And we have similar numbers for the UK. So a significant proportion of women search for information. And again, we see that being a first mother and multiple time mother matters. So this is a graph that we take from this survey for the UK. And as you can see, there are three main sources of information for pregnant women. The main source is the National Health Service booklet, which is a booklet that you get as soon as you show up in a practice or at the hospital and you find out you're pregnant. And it contains kind of official guidelines about pregnancy and delivery. Many mothers do the prenatal course, which is something standard. As you can see, it's way more popular among first-time mothers. Multiple-time mothers here in the white bar, they tend not to repeat the course. So this is something they don't do twice. But then you have the internet, which quickly became a relevant source of information. In the survey, they ask about what type of websites mothers visit, and they see that the NHS official website is visited substantially, and it collects almost the same information as the booklet, so official guidelines about pregnancy and delivery. But then a large share of mothers also look for information in other websites, blogs, whatever. So they declare that they learn about the topic also from other sources. So then the question is, and I think it's very relevant today when we're talking about COVID-19, vaccinations, and the perception of the people have about these topics, is about the quality of information online. And many studies in the medical literature point out that the quality of health recommendation and health information that you find online has a large quality variance. So you can go from very high quality information, so websites where you can find good, reliable statistics, documented facts, links to scholarly journals, links to official guidelines. But on the other end of the spectrum, you can end up into chat rooms, blogs, and low quality information. Sometimes this information is even raising concerns among practitioners because you can easily find wrong information and false information. And then this type of information can easily and rapidly propagate throughout the internet through hyperlinks, through blog chat, through chats, through blogs. And this is a reason for concern for healthcare authorities. And this is why institutions like the National Health Service in the UK, they try to promote their official guidelines, they try to promote their websites and their YouTube channel, and it's the same for the US, it's the same in many other OECD countries. Actually, if you notice nowadays with the COVID-19 pandemic, the governments ask Facebook, Google to have banners in the app or on the web version to kind of link to official information. Sometimes they were asked to filter for information that was considered plainly wrong or false. So governments are putting more and more attention into these topics. Also because I think that there is a consensus now, and our paper contributes to the literature in showing that patients respond to the information they find online and they are influenced then in their decisions. So then, as I said before, why childbirth? So this study, we think, is gets to causality, also thanks to the kind of setting we place ourselves in. So childbirth is an interesting procedure to study, first of all, because it's the most common medical reason for admission in hospital and for staying in an hospital for at least one night. There are 750,000 deliveries in the UK every year. It's interesting because there is no attrition. So as soon as you discover that you're pregnant and you continue your pregnancy, then you cannot avoid the choice of one or the other procedure. So you cannot postpone it. There is no attrition from the data. In few months, you have to go for delivery and you have to choose a procedure. Instead, if you think about other procedures like a hip replacement, you can postpone it. You can say, okay, I'm gonna wait. I go for drugs, treatments. I don't want to get surgery. So that would be much harder to study. In this case, in some months, you have to make a choice. It's also a nice setting because then you have the time to make a choice. So you have time to look for information, and then the internet can play a role. You have several weeks to do it. And finally, it's an interesting setting because in the UK, it's completely free. So it's free of charge. You show up in the hospital, you will be linked to an hospital, and then there is no price involved in the decision. It's only a matter of information, which procedure you want. It's also a simple setting for the mother because you don't have to be a great expert. Well, you can learn about procedures, but then the choice is simple. It's either natural delivery or C-section. So from the perspective of the choice set, it's a rather simple choice. Among C-sections, you can have two types of C-sections, so the elective ones, and these are scheduled ex ante with your doctor, and all the care pathway is planned in advance. And then there are emergency C-sections. So these are C-sections that were not planned. Labor started naturally, but then something goes south and the medical equipe decides to go for an emergency procedure. That's actually interesting because in the data we can observe whether the C-section was an emergency one or a C-section or an elective. And we use the emergency C-sections as a placebo test for our identification because there we should not find that effect. Okay, so this is entirely driven by the conditions of the mother. What the mother learned online should not play a role. So we use it as a placebo test in our empirical analysis. So generally, usually in previous presentations, I always get this type of questions. So I want to kind of be upfront on this and maybe stop or dissipate concerns. So what about the incentives of healthcare providers? Our story is mainly a story of demand side driven effect. So these are the patients who put pressure on the doctor, learn on the internet, and then put pressures on the doctor to get what they want. Can it also be a supply side story? So are the doctors changing behavior? So we tend to be, we don't think this is playing any role, at least in our exercise, for the following reasons that I'm listing in these lines. So first of all, NHS employees, they have a fixed salary, and what they earn doesn't depend on the performance or results. So the procedure they perform, they're not gonna increase their bonuses or so forth because there are no bonuses. NHS hospitals are publicly funded. So for the hospital, is also not particularly important to push more for C-sections. And in any case, we will have variation of internet exposure across mothers, but these mothers, they face on average hospitals that have the same rules and same incentives because the system in the UK is fully public. So in any case, there is no heterogeneity among hospitals and in our sample. So first of all, there are no incentives for C-sections, and in any case, all hospitals have the same incentives at play. Finally, I would like to maybe point at another thing. Because of our identification strategy that I showed you before, we compare blocks that are very small in size. And we compare mothers living in adjacent blocks. So blocks that are proximate one to each other, one to the other. And the size of these blocks and their geographical proximity implies that these mothers will refer to the same hospital on average. And in fact, that's what we find. So 90% of the matched mothers go to the very same hospitals, and so they face the very same doctors. So not only the hospitals don't have an incentive to select one procedure or another, but also the mothers are facing on average the very same supply. Okay, so we don't think that the effects that we find can be driven by any doctor-related factor at play. So just to close the institutional setting, what about the internet diffusion in England? So for the rest of Europe, broadband diffusion started at the end of the 90s, when finally ADSL technology was developed and launched. Most of the internet access in the UK at the time, so in the decade that we studied, was through the telephone network. So the telephone network accounts for slightly more than 80% of market share, and the remaining market share is on the cable network, which is also providing broadband internet. The internet access that we use, that we have data on, is the first one. So the one on the telephone network. We don't have, we don't use the cable. And the internet access over the telephone network required an upgrade from the analogical signal transmission, that was the previous technology, into digital signal. And that happened when DSL technology had been developed. The network is indeed a network, so it's made of nodes, so cabinets that are connected to each other to ensure connectivity. So the fact that before with the telephone you could call from London to Manchester, so through the nodes of the network, and afterwards that you could transmit data for internet, through the internet. So you have all these nodes that are connected to each other, and each node provides signal to well-defined areas that we perfectly observe. So for every local exchange of the network, we observe the exact catchment area. And we know all the addresses that are connected to the local exchange. So we can perfectly reconstruct the catchment area, so the topology of this network. What is important in this market, is what happened in the middle, a bit before the middle of the sample, so in 2003, 2004. And what happened was the introduction of open access policies. So briefly, what's the story of the internet in the UK? At the end of the 90s, the internet market was still dominated by one large incumbent, that it was British Telecom. It was the all national company, state-owned and privatized in the 80s. That company was clearly the dominant player in the telephone industry, and regulators at the European level, because this was a situation that was common in many countries. In France, you had France Telecom. In Germany, you had Deutsche Telekom. So all these large incumbents could transfer their dominant position on the telephone market into the new market of internet services. And regulators were afraid that this would happen, and they would exploit a dominant position, becoming a monopolist. So what they did was to impose member states and their regulation authority to liberalize the market. So they imposed British Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, all the national incumbents to only focus on the management of the network, and then allow private investors to enter downstream, use the network, and then resell broadband internet to final users. Okay? The market evolution completely changed after this deregulation of the sector. So as you can see in these graphs, here on the left you have the evolution of broadband penetration throughout the 2000s, and on the right you have the evolution of internet speed. For the first part of the 2000s, until we had in 2004, 2003, 2004, the regulation passed, internet take-up was growing slowly. So in 5 years, from 2000 to 2004, it grew from 0 to 18%. In the following 5 years, it jumped to more than 60%. And then it continued. And similarly for internet speed. So it was a very slow growth at the beginning of the decade, and a rapid increase as soon as private investments started to kick in and companies jumped into the market and started to provide better and better internet services. We have another paper that I wrote with other co-authors, one of them is also in this one, where we show that the new entrants, the private companies, the private ISPs, the private internet service providers, were outperforming the incumbent in terms of quality, reliability, and all dimensions of the quality of the connection. So it was very important for this market to allow for competition, and the picture completely changed in a few years. So let me quickly go through the data sources. Let me see how much time I have. Okay, so the data sources, so we have the universe of deliveries in the UK. So we have potentially 7 million mothers, data on 7 million mothers delivering in these 11 years. And this is provided by the UK Department of Health. We have very precise information on the data is anonymized, so we don't know who these people are. But we have detailed information on their risk profile, their medical status. So we know the mother's characteristics and a full list of risk factors, including comorbid diabetes, previous conditions, and so forth. We observe the procedure. So we have procedure codes, and we can identify C-sections and natural delivery. We also observe outcomes. So post-delivery outcomes for the mother and the newborn. So then we can see whether there is an adverse event. following the delivery. Importantly for us, we can geolocate the mothers because together with all this health information, we also know the LSOA of residence of the mother. The LSOA is almost the smallest census area in the UK census. To give you an idea of the size of these areas, that's why I'm calling them blocks. An LSOA has approximately, as on average, 1,500 residents, which means 600 households, which in London is just few buildings. So these are very small areas, so among almost the smallest that you can find in the census. Data on the internet, they come from the regulator that basically gave us exact location of the local exchanges, the exact information on all the postcodes that they serve, so that we can reconstruct the catchment areas. A postcode in the UK is an area of 50 meters. So we can really draw these borders for the local exchanges. And then this allows us to compute a measure of distance between the LSOA, where the mother lives, and the local exchange. And in the next slide, I will explain you why this is important for us. We also know which type of technology has been installed in the local exchange and when. So we know when the different vintages of ADSL technology arrives. And then because we know the LSOA, which is a census area, we match the data with demographic characteristics of the neighborhood. So the age structure, employment rate, everything that you can learn from the census. So why did I tell you that it's important for us to know the distance between the mother and the local exchange? The reason is the following. The quality of an internet connection at the time, very importantly at the time with the first vintages of ADSL technology, was depending on two factors. The type of ADSL installed in your local exchange, and second, the distance between your house and the cabinet. This is because what is called in the industry the last mile, so the cable, the wire that connects your house to the local exchange is in copper. And copper is a very bad material to transmit a digital signal because it has a strong decay with distance. That's the decay that is estimated in the literature and refers to an ADSL 2+ technology. And here you can see the percentage of the actual speed as a function of distance. So only if you live really nearby the local exchange, you can really get the theoretical speed of the connection. So they promise you, say, 20 megabits, but as soon as you start moving far away from the local exchange, the quality of the signal is going to decline. So that's, and this was something very, very well known in the industry and by regulators, and this is something that we exploit. So that's the essence of our identification strategy. We look for the following LSOAs. We look for LSOAs that have the following properties. So they share a border, and in this way, the geographical area is small, and mothers who live on the two sides of the border are balanced in characteristics. So they are good counterfactual to each other. They have the same unemployment rate, they do the same jobs, they have the same income, they have the same education on average. They simply live on the two sides of a street. But because of the conformation and the relative positions of the local exchanges, some of them have good internet, in this case the red mothers, and some of them have bad internet, in some cases even no internet, because the distance is so large that the quality of the signal is so bad that they have no internet, and these are the green mothers. So we match the mothers living in the neighboring LSOAs, and then we look at different behavior, okay? Now, because the census borders have any relation with the local exchange borders, we have to look for very specific LSOAs in which the border is almost identical to the LSOA border. So these two, they fit the criteria. Other LSOAs, they don't. So you see this LSOA here doesn't meet the criteria because basically the LSOA overlaps with the border. Okay, because here in the map, sorry, I was not maybe clear on this. The solid dark black line are borders of the local exchanges. The gray line are the borders of the LSOAs. Okay, so they not always coincide. Okay, because census borders are not, do not take into consideration the internet topology. So internet, the rollout of the telephone network was done in the 30s of the last centuries, so more than almost 100 years ago. The nice thing of our setting is that it delivers perfectly balanced mothers in characteristics. So here I'm comparing close and far LSOAs. So let me go back a bit on this. So every time we identify a couple, we assign, so we say that there is a close LSOA and a far LSOA. In this graph, the close LSOA is the red one. The far LSOA is the green one, and that's based on the distance between the centroid of the LSOA and the local exchange. So we divide the LSOAs in these two groups. What we see is that they are balanced in characteristics. So our geographical criteria give us mothers that have the same characteristics on average. And the other nice thing is that the LSOAs that satisfy the criteria are also very similar to the average LSOA in the UK, which you see here in the full sample columns. So this identification is giving us balanced mothers that resemble the mothers of the UK in general. Okay, so our findings are also kind of, they have good external validity because we are not picking very strange LSOAs, I don't know, maybe in rural areas or only in the city centers. So the LSOAs that we have are representative of the general LSOA in the UK. Mothers are characteristics, are balanced with respect to the characteristics of the neighborhood in which they live, but also in their risk factors and their characteristics. They are also balanced in the C-section rate at the beginning of the sample. So before the internet started, they didn't have any significant difference in the C-section rates. The only difference they have, and this is by construction, is in the relative distance to the local exchange because of the way we constructed the data. So the close mothers, they are approximately at 1.8, 1.7 kilometers. The far mothers, they are on average at more than 3 kilometers to the local exchange. And this has a consequence on the quality of their internet and data take up in their area. And this is, for instance, and this is actually what's going on in terms of speed. So this is the solid line is the average speed that we can predict is available in the LSOAs of close mothers. The dashed line is the average speed that we can predict is available in the LSOAs of the far mothers over time. And as you can see, there is a wedge that is driven by the distance, the relative distance to the local exchange. C-section rates, as I said at the beginning of the talk, were going up during this decade, and that's a common phenomenon in the OECD countries now. And the World Healthcare Organization is asking countries to kind of curb this increasing trend, because the consensus among healthcare practitioners is that most of them are not necessary. And at the end of the day, it's a surgery, so this can have long-term consequences on the mothers. But yeah, I mean, during our sample in the UK, the rate was always increasing. And now let me show you what's going on when we split the LSOAs between close and far. So before the internet boomed in the UK, the two groups of LSOA moved together. They were on the same trend and they have almost identical C-section rates. After the diffusion of the internet, they kind of separated and they stayed there. Now, for the next slides, where we go into the econometric models, we want to check whether this difference is significant and what kind of matters are driving the split between the two groups. So that's the empirical model we estimate. We model the outcome for the mother I living in LSOA-J, going to the hospital age in ERT as a function of characteristics of the mother X that include risk factors, age, bunch of controls that we can include thanks to the data, the very detailed data that we have on mother characteristics. Then we include time fixed effect, so year dummies, LSOA fixed effect, hospital fixed effects, and to account for potentially for the presence of local trends in the neighborhood, we have linear trends at the LSOA pair level. Okay, so we also control for possible local trends in the neighborhood where the mothers live. And then we have a classic diff in diff. So we have the dummy to be closed for being closed, and then because we have the LSOA fixed effect is dropped. A post that then is dropped because of the time dummies, and then we have the DID, the difference in difference coefficient that is our coefficient of interest. Of course, I mean, we want also to include characteristics of the mother, although they are balanced, but because, yeah, it improves the precision of the estimates. Some risk factors are highly predictive of obtaining a C-section, like having a lot of risk factors increases substantially this baseline probability. So this is in the paper, as you might have seen, our starting our starting point, our benchmark regression. We go for this one. Then we also have one that uses the predicted speed at the LSOA. But we start with this one because we think it is the econometric specification that requires the minimal set of assumptions. It only requires to be causal orthogonality between the error term and being on the two sides of the border. So basically, when you chose your house, you just did it, and then it happens that you are unlucky or lucky. And we think we can believe this assumption. So there is a correlation between the error term, everything that we don't observe or we don't control for, and being on one or the other side of the border of the local exchange. It also doesn't require any assumption on the functional form of the decay speed. It simply requires that internet quality is decreasing with distance. Okay. In the other specification where we use the speed, we have to use the relationship between distance and quality that comes out of the exercise of fitting the speed that we measure with speed tests and distance with some polynomial. Okay, and then, I mean, it depends on the polynomial that you use. So you have to make further assumptions on the functional form, which here we don't need. We just need that there is this relationship, which is a negative relationship between distance and quality. And these are the results. So we find that being in a closed LSOA, so having better internet, increases the probability to ask for a C-section. So with the arrival of internet, mothers start to do different things depending on whether they have internet or not, or they have good internet or not. But on the other dimensions, they are all identical. And the effect is driven by first-time mothers. Consistently with what I said before, we don't find any effect on the emergency. It is mainly driven simply by your characteristics, by your risk profile and what's going on when you start the delivery. We don't find any effect on the newborns and mothers. So these are outcomes on the mothers and newborns. So for instance, these are newborns. We don't find any effect on fetal distress or even death. So it's, and when we look at the profile, the risk profile of mothers who are getting these extra C-sections, they're clearly mothers that they don't have high risk. So they are mothers who are convinced that they want something different and they manage to get it. Yeah, maybe there is a question.
No, I just want to remind you, we can wrap up maybe in, for 3-4 minutes.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes.
Yeah. And then we can open up for the questions, like to the audience.
Questions, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, then we verify our main findings with the alternative specification strategy, in which we include the speed instead of the diff in diff. So we predict the speed at the neighborhood level, and then we include it in the regression. The speed has some shortcomings. The main one is that we measure speed with an error, which can be up to 20% of the real speed. And this creates noise in the estimates. So we get kind of, as we expect, a downward bias and larger standard error. So the only thing that again pops up, because the effect is huge, is again the first-time mothers driving the result. Another thing that I want to emphasize is the heterogeneous effect of the internet. We find when we split the mothers between low income, high income, low education, high education, is that the effect is driven by the low income, low education mothers. And if we look at the trajectory of C-section rates over time of these groups of mothers, we see that indeed low income, low educated mothers kind of close the gap they have with high income, high educated mothers over time. This is because high income, high educated mothers, they tend to have on average more C-sections because most of them work in a higher percentage. And because they have a higher percentage, they work more often, they want to schedule their C-section to go back to work earlier. And that's why they have a baseline higher probability of getting a C-section. Internet is kind of contributing to closing this gap, because the low-income mothers are more and more influenced by the internet, and then they get more and more C-sections. Finally, in the paper, but you can read it in the paper, we do some back-of-the-envelope calculations on the cost for the healthcare service of these extra C-sections, because C-sections are more expensive than natural delivery, and so this is generating extra costs. But I don't want to maybe spend time on this. So to conclude, we find that better internet access has an impact on health decisions. It's changing what is the classic example when I teach my students of a credence good market, so a market with strong asymmetric information, where you have one party that is well informed and another party that is not. We studied in the C-section procedures, but we think that this can have very much the same story can be at work if you think about drugs, prescription of drugs and medical treatments. Interestingly, the effect is driven by first-time mothers, which you can think are in this market the inexperienced consumers. The multiple-time mothers do not seem to be very much affected. And yeah, this has an impact then on the cost for the healthcare service. And then it's all. I can keep this VigNet. This was a VigNet that it's more than 10 years old. So doctors know that something is going on in their market, in their sector since a while.
Thank you so much, Professor Mattia. That's a very interesting work. And I think the house is open for questions, and we are going to have some questions. Yeah, please, attendees, if you have questions, please, you may ask.
Yeah, I had a quick question, Mattia. Chirantan here.
Yep.
So maybe a couple of questions. You have in the observations these hospitals, right? Do you know which doctor is treating the patient, the mother?
No, we know only the hospital. We don't have a doctor identifier.
Is there a way to somehow categorize the quality of the hospital? and show that that could have a muting effect even if there is a pressure created by the mother to do a C-section. Um, and I worry about this from a welfare context, because if WHO and everyone else is saying that doing C-sections has its own implications in a welfare sense globally, is this a good or a bad? The result that you have is worrying, because we don't also know for these LSOA mothers what kind of information they are seeking. I mean, are they being led by some influence through the blogs and stuff and all that? So if you could speak to that a little bit, that may help.
Yeah, exactly. So let me go back to this slide where we do the back of the envelope calculation. So when we do the back of the envelope calculation, we calculate the short-run extra cost generated for the healthcare sector, for the healthcare service. And it's not large. It's around £6 million per year, which is negligible given the budget of this of the National Health Service. Of course, in the calculation, this is just the difference between the cost of the two procedures and the slightly longer stay that you have to do in the hospital in case you go for a C-section. Then, of course, in this calculation, we don't take into account psychological costs. Maybe a mother, after learning about the potential side consequences of a natural delivery that goes wrong, can have serious, or the experience, can have serious psychological costs. And then forcing her, after she learned that she has to do anyway a natural delivery, can be very bad, okay? Mm-hmm. So we are agnostic, we don't know about this, we cannot actually compute these costs. On the other hand, or the benefits then of a C-section, because then if the person is really shocked by what she learns and she really doesn't want a natural delivery, then it's a benefit to go for a C-section. We also don't take into account the long-term extra cost that you can have for a C-section, because in the end, it's a surgery, it's an invasive procedure. And first of all, it increases the probability to have a second C-section in a following pregnancy. And it also that we cannot compute, or we didn't compute the long-term costs of having a surgery in general. You know, you might have other long-term consequences. So these are what the numbers that we have in the paper are really just the short-term costs. Mm-hmm. So no psychological elements, no long-term costs or benefits. Then, when we started this project, we had this trade-off in mind. Should we go for this nice universe of mothers for which we don't know what they do online, but we can make sure that our identification is robust in the way I define robust, and that's what I presented. We believe that we really captured the effect, but we don't know exactly what they do in their home. But we discarded the other option because there are not many reliable surveys, actually none that we know, that collects the information on what they do online and tells you what they deliver, the procedure they choose.
Yeah, so one way to cut it may be that hospital quality. So
yeah, and the hospital quality, yeah. So we also have a set of regressions that you can find in the paper, but I didn't have the time to present. We don't know the doctor, but what we can see is that mothers, they stay in the hospital where they are supposed to go. So there are only 400 hospitals in the UK, and generally people then have to travel a lot. This is the reason why, as I told you, they keep choosing the same hospital. We don't find any effect of the internet in making you traveling farther to get to an hospital that has more C-section rates. Which maybe you learned. So we don't see them moving and shopping around for a different hospital. What we think is going on is they manage to get what they want in the hospital where they are supposed to go. And then we cannot open the black box of the relationship with their doctors, but we have good reasons to think that something must be at work in the interaction they have with the doctors, because otherwise we shouldn't find any effect, because the mothers are perfectly balanced in characteristics. They go to the same hospital. The only difference is that we can, and that's the way we constructed the exercise is in the internet exposure.
Mm-hmm. And so one last quick follow-up, so if I may. So you know the immigration intensity across these LSOS?
Yeah, that's one of the census variables that we have. Yeah.
The reason I ask is I'm just thinking whether, so I don't know whether it's, I think it may be actually okay. So do households get to know the gender of the child before delivery? And is there a way
That's,
to
I don't know how it works in the UK. In the rest of Europe, you can go for the genetic test at the third month or later. But that's not provided by the healthcare service. So that's something you have to pay for. Is not in the basic supply. So then I don't know what kind of households they want to know. I don't know in the UK. For instance, in Belgium, it's popular to do it, but then you don't want to know. So the rest of the family knows.
Yeah.
And that's also in other countries in Europe. And then they make you, then they prepare the gifts for the baby,
Right.
knowing the gender, but you don't know. This is something you discover the day of the delivery. But
I'm just thinking of a separate paper with your data. Very cool work. So some gender distortions in the decision to go for C-section as mediated.
So what's your prior? What would be your prior?
It depends. I mean, it depends on the nature of the household, that whether if it's I'm definitely in India, for example, perhaps there are differential choices between getting the delivery done faster and in a more secure fashion for the male child than for the female child.
Okay.
So yeah.
I don't think that in Europe, well, I don't know. I
mean, yeah, I don't think it may be relevant to your context, but yeah. Adrija, you have any questions? And others, please also ask.
Yeah, please, any more questions? I have one question. I mean, the kind of internet, apart from the access, were you able to do a follow-up? What kind of information they're getting from the internet? Because ideally, if you consider, let's say, websites or static pages, you don't need too much internet dependency, right? But let's say for YouTube videos where there's a downloading option, streaming option, the internet speed becomes more important.
Yes.
So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there are pros and cons in the exercise that we run. So first of all, throughout our sample, social network were not yet popular as they are now. So Facebook started in Europe in 2008.
6-7, yeah.
Yeah, well, it became popular really in 2008. It entered a bit earlier, but at the beginning didn't grow very fast. Same for YouTube. So I think it was launched in the UK in 2007. So for most of our sample, it was really about blogs and pages that could be loaded in a reasonable time. But still, we provide the numbers in the paper. A web page with some photos, a bit of text. If you were living far away from your local exchange, you had very basic internet at the time, say theoretical speed of 2 mega, it could take more than 20 minutes to load, and then the web page could be broken. You know, this very people who are of my generation know the experience, frustrating experience of slow internet nowadays. So there are pros and cons in using our data. So the social network is not there, and there are recent papers who now focus on the effect of Twitter, Facebook. The good thing of our data is that we still have variation in internet exposure that nowadays you don't have. That's the problem to run empirical exercises today. Everybody has internet, so you don't have a control group. In our exercise, you still have a control group, and you can find instruments for being in the control group or identification strategies. All the exercise that you have today, they have to try to convince you that what they find is causal. but that's an hard job. Because internet is ubiquitous, your decision to be on Twitter is endogenous, or to go on Facebook is highly related to your characteristics.
Right.
But it's true. So our exercise is about the early days of
internet.
Yes.
Yeah, it also reminds me of that Fish and the Cell Phone paper by Bob Jensen in QJE, where he exploits the variation in broadband distribution, I think, or cell phone availability in Kerala, and looks at these fishermen going out into the sea and using the cell phone to get better matched markets while coming back and selling their haul.
Yeah. In all these papers, you need the moment in which the technology is introduced and a good source of variation for exposure.
Yeah.
So that's a bit the struggle, and also we try to go back and get data, but we started this project too late. So to get data on internet activity, but now it's almost 15 years. So the middle of the sample is 15 years ago. So it's very hard to reconstruct, to get good data about the internet use. Google Trend, for instance, started in 2004.
That's right.
And then the geographical, so Google Trend only gives you the time series and the cross-section of 20 cities. So you don't have a lot of cross-sectional geographical variation, and it's very aggregated. We try to do our best, and when we evaluated the possible alternatives, we thought that we really had an edge in the size of the sample, the fact that it's the universe of mothers. But that's true. What they do at home, as I said, is a bit of a black box. That's why we have to provide this ancillary information. We look at the few surveys that we could find on activity.
We have one. Thank you so much. We have one question from one of the participants. How much were the decisions influenced by spouse or family members? How do we know it was only the woman's choice? So
yeah, that's a good point. So we don't know. So in this survey, they don't ask about this sorts of dynamics. So and so maybe one could check. So for the LSOA, we know the size of the household. So one could try to compare LSOAs with more single parents, but we don't know. We have no idea what's going on. So when I say mothers can easily be the household, then my perception based on my experience as a father is that the mother has the last say on what she wants to get. I didn't want to.
A lot of context specific also. What's happening in the West is little different. What happens in India, maybe that's.
Yeah, probably it's a culture, more of a culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a.
Maybe. I mean, we know the ethnic composition of the LSOA. So one could try to see whether LSOA with different ethnic compositions, they have different effects.
Right.
But then you start cutting our sample in many, it's not easy because in the end we end up with 2,000 LSOAs that fit the geographical criteria. So you cannot cut too much.
Right. Okay, do we have any other questions from the attendees? No. Thank you so much, Dr. Mattia. It was a lovely presentation, and thanks for your time. And it was a very impactful presentation, I would say. And thanks to all the attendees. Stay safe, stay well, and thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and it was nice. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. I'm in.